I chose to look into the effect of perspective on warfare. And the books I read, or no, don't do that. Catch-22, For Whom the Bell Tolls, and then I also read Slaughterhouse-Five, and then I used a book that I read last try, All Quiet on the Western Front, because that also relates to this topic. And then I also looked into some historical documents. So, there's always been war in human history. I mean, you look back any point in human history, even prehistory, there's war. And so, war is kind of frowned upon today because there's a humanitarian view that, it's not us versus them, we're all people, and we're fighting them, and that might not be the best thing. But back in the day, people didn't realize that because they only had one perspective, their perspective. Because if you lived in ancient society, let's say you're a Roman, the only news, and so let's say Rome's greatest enemy, well, maybe it was Carthage. So let's say, if you're a Roman, the only news you're going to hear about Carthage is that either your army defeated them or your army didn't. So you're not going to be able to associate and sort of empathize with a Carthaginian because they're your enemy, and so it's us versus them. And that trend continued pretty much throughout human history in all countries and regions until the Renaissance. And I mean, there were in other cultures, 'cause I'm talking more from a Western culture, other cultures obviously had their own renaissances, but they sort of said, we're all people, and it's not us versus them, it's like, you look at them and they're just like us. And so, a good example is in For Whom the Bell Tolls. That's a book by Ernest Hemingway about the Spanish Civil War. And so in the Spanish Civil War, it was pro-fascist against pro-communists, and the communists were supported by the Soviet Union, and the fascists were supported by Germany and Italy, and sort of the US and other major powers stayed out of it because they didn't want to choose either side. Except a lot of young Americans went and fought on the communist side because they're sort of idealists and I guess they thought nothing better to do because it was during the Great Depression. And so one of them, named Robert Jordan, is the main character For Whom the Bell Tolls. And he starts out the war and he is very enthusiastic about the war, and he thinks, I'm just going to kill all these fascists, they're bad people, because he's thinking of people like Mussolini and Hitler. And eventually, by the end of the book, he realizes that the people he's actually fighting aren't these evil fascists, they're people just like him, because the people who he's fighting and killing aren't people like Mussolini and Hitler. He's fighting and killing other peasants and commoners that have just been roped into this cause by the fascists. And then another of the books, All Quiet on the Western Front, deals with World War I, and the most significant thing about it, I think, is that it was written by a German, and we are all, we're all on one side, so the American and British side, and so people a lot of times think that World War I was like World War II, how there's a moral side and immoral side, fighting for democracy, but it really wasn't, because although the US and Great Britain were democracies, the other great power on the Allied side was Russia, and that was probably the worst country in terms of crimes against humanity out of any of them involved. And so Germany, it was ruled by a Kaiser, but it was still fairly democratic. It had a parliament. It wasn't called parliament, it was called Reichstag. But so it's told from the perspective of a German, so when you read it as someone coming from the opposite side of the war, you realize that the people fighting, they're not evil, they're not bad, they're just like you and your soldiers. I also read Johnny Got His Gun, and that's from the perspective of an American soldier. So you kind of compare those two and you realize that those two soldiers are way more similar than that soldier is to his leaders. And then in Catch-22, it also goes along with that because the main character, Yossarian, at first, he's pretty worried about the Germans. He thinks they're going to shoot him down because he's a bomber pilot, or I think brigadier, I don't know, I forget the exact position he is on the bomber, but he flies in bombers and bomb stuff. But eventually he realizes that the people who are threatening his life the most are actually his superior officers, because they keep forcing him to do more and more missions, and like so they're the ones that are really his enemies. So it's again like he's sympathizing. You sympathize more with your fellow soldiers than you do with your officers and your leaders. And then Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut is about the bombing of Dresden, where the Allied bombing forces firebombed Dresden, which was this really old city. It didn't have any military facilities in it, and they just bombed it to try to weaken morale of the German people, and they destroyed it completely and killed anywhere. The figures range between 40,000 and 120,000, so I mean, they killed a lot of people. And it's told from the point of view of an American soldier who is a POW in Germany, and so he's in Dresden when this happens, and you see the people of Germany and how they're being affected. They have to pay for the crimes of their leader and leaders, the Nazis and Hitler, because even though it's not their fault. Yeah. And then some other examples, like you can go ahead and keep this one. A lot of times, people's views, they only get to see what their government sees, so they don't get to associate with people on the other side of the world. Like here's a propaganda poster from World War I, and that this is sort of racist against Germans, what they're going for, I guess. And the German is coming across from Europe, that's all war-torn, and jumping onto America and killing Lady Liberty. They're saying like, oh, Germany, because they're non-democracy, they're terrible, terrible people. But really they weren't. And then you see it from the Germans' perspective, so what an average German would see during World War I would be this sort of propaganda poster, where it has a giant spider who represents the UK, and since the UK was the biggest empire at this point, imperialism, it's spreading its legs even further and taking over Europe. So I mean, the citizens of each country, they don't really get a chance to sympathize with the other country because the government controls the information that they see. And then another example, and then this is what actually happened in World War I. I mean, it's pretty bad. So, like, in terms of emotional scarring and stuff like that, World War I was one of the worst. And then another thing is, like, during the Cold War, I mean, it's not technically a war, but each side fed its people different types of propaganda to make them fear the other side. Because, I mean, like, in the first one, the U.S. would have, like the Red Scares, like under McCarthy, they would say, like, oh, you're a communist, you're going to come in and take over our country and overthrow everything. And so people became scared of communists, and so they were scared of Russia, the Soviet Union, and so they couldn't sympathize with them. And then in the Soviet Union, the government did the same thing, and so they'd say, like, this one, I know it's in Russian, but I got translation, and this is supposed to be America, and it's like, oh, capitalism, look, it only has 22%, and we have something higher. Yeah.
It says 20%.
Yeah, I know. It's kind of weird, but the translation said, I mean, it's like trying to say that communism works better, and oh yeah, and it's trying to establish again that us versus them view, that so that their people will be fine with war because they think that they have to do it, because they're going to help everyone. And it kind of, in Alyssa's presentation, she talked about imperialism and sort of people like U.S. Marines coming in and trying to establish dictators, and that sort of ties in because they sort of think they know what's best for the people, and they sort of treat them like they're not equals. I mean, people don't really know because you only get the information that your government feeds you. So I mean, it's better now because we live in a much freer society, and there's a lot more information in today's society than there was, well, really in any society in history because of the internet, and we live in a fairly free time period, especially in our country and our culture. And so, sort of the conclusion I came to was that people have never, like, they weren't bothered by war as long as they thought that it was us versus them, but as they started to realize that these people are people just like us, and so sort of realize that there isn't a good side or a bad side in really any war. There might be some wars where you could argue that, but most wars, there isn't a good side or a bad side. It's just our side and their side, and the people on their side are probably pretty close to the ones on ours.